Syria. 2 weeks after the war began, Aton Ben Royal as commander-in-chief stood one morning on a hill east of Palmyra in Syria. Before him lay the flat land stretching to the Euphrates. The dust from Israeli tank columns lay like a veil over the road to the northeast. 3 more days to the river, he told his generals, and then Israel's border will change forever. His voice was calm, but a feverish light glowed in his eyes. Radio messages from Tel Aviv initially reported only victories. Precise target coordinates for the next strikes were provided by Washington. The conquest of a part of western Iraq and northern Jordan was no longer a dream, it was within reach. The Islamic Emirate of Syria was suffering under sanctions and was militarily weak. Ben Royal, who usually monitored the flow of command from the bunker near Tel Aviv, listened to the reports with quiet satisfaction. The front was advancing. The United States stood with Israel. Cities like Deir ez-Zor and smaller villages along the Kaba River were captured in rapid succession. Damascus was taken after a lot of bloody house-to-house fighting. Drones circled incessantly in the sky, missiles struck positions, and the defenders were overwhelmed. Just as Joshua took the cities of Canaan, so you will take the land as far as the Euphrates, preached the priests and rabbis in Ben Royal's entourage, while soldiers scribbled verses from the book of Joshua on their helmets. After some weeks, it became clear that the war was no easy triumph. Militias had entrenched themselves in the ruins of Aleppo and Homs, fighting fiercely. They waged a guerrilla war, attacking supply convoys, blowing up bridges, and disappearing back into the rubble. Dozens of men fell for every city block they captured. Ben Royal showed no mercy. Entire neighborhoods were razed to the ground, and suspects were summarily executed. Israeli flags flew everywhere. In Aleppo, where crumbling buildings stood like skeletons against the sky, Israeli troops encountered fierce resistance. What had initially appeared to be scattered gangs coalesced into an army that launched raids and used drones against the tanks themselves and, above all, against supply convoys. Tanks crashed head-on into the makeshift barricades, machine gun fire pounded over the ruins, and the sand was soaked with the blood of both sides. Tadmor, so often the scene of uprisings and conquests throughout history, once again became a battlefield. The capture of Raqqa, too, turned into a costly house-to-house battle. Joseph Skach, the Jew with Czech roots, sat at the kitchen table, the radio playing softly, while outside a dull veil of dust hung over Jerusalem. The news reports sounded monotonous. The offensive in the north is stalling, logistical difficulties, international mediation attempts. He turned off the radio. This must be the same phrases, he thought, as back then in Lebanon, in the Sinai, in Gaza. The Islamic Emirate of Syria had not even a sufficient amount of effective ballistic missiles, though. In the first days of this war, people had danced in the streets, old men with flags, children with paper crowns, rabbis calling out the name of Abraham. Skach had watched from his window. Now the tanks were stuck somewhere in the Syrian house-to-house fighting or advancing more slowly than planned through the desert dust, and no one on the home front really knew why. The news anchors spoke of operational reorganization, the commentators of strategic pause. Skach called it standstill, and that was the only honest thing about it. He went to the window. The blue and white flags still hung in the narrow alleys of his neighborhood, but to him they looked limp, faded by the sun. The men on the street spoke more quietly. There was something in the air that he knew, the tipping of certainty into worry. Skach thought about how often people in this city had believed that history was finally turning in favor of the righteous, and how often it had simply continued on, indifferent and sluggish. On the balcony opposite, an old rabbi prayed with his eyes closed, his lips moving rapidly. Skach watched him for a moment, then closed the curtain. "He's talking to someone, but is he answering?" he muttered, switching his laptop back on because the silence in his apartment was becoming too loud. Some in Israel were still rejoicing. Finally, they said, the ancient promise to Abraham was being fulfilled. To your descendants I will give this land from the river of Egypt to the great river, the Euphrates. But the offensive was about to come to an abrupt halt due to an unexpected event. The impact. A scorching hot afternoon, the sky shimmering an ominous grey-blue, when a strange stripe appeared on the horizon. At first, it was just a dark veil, barely perceptible, but then the air began to vibrate. A distant rumble, like the echo of an ancient wrath, rolled across the landscape. Suddenly, the first fragments pierced the atmosphere, glowing splinters, scarcely larger than fists, but with the force of bullets. They rained down like a deadly hailstorm, shattering roofs, setting forests ablaze, and making the earth tremble. People throughout the Mediterranean and North America looked up, captivated by a mixture of fascination and fear. Then, a white flash flickered across the Mediterranean, so bright it burned even through closed eyelids. The first fragment of the comet Johnson-Smith had crashed into the water about 200 kilometers off the coast of Israel. Seconds later, the sea was no longer still, but a rising wall of water. The wave struck Gaza first, then Ashdod, then Tel Aviv. In entire neighborhoods, the water stood ankle deep. To the north, the wave rolled toward the Lebanese coast, to the south, against Alexandria. Radio messages screamed in confusion, ports flooded. Oil terminals destroyed. Thousands missing. Only in the following days did the full extent of the catastrophe become clear. The words echoed through the command center in Jerusalem, an endless reverberation of desperate radio messages that, in the first hours after the comet impact, had documented the chaos on the Israeli coast. The offensive in Syria, which just a few days earlier had swept through the deserts and hills of the neighboring country like an unstoppable fire, came to a standstill. The dream of extending Israel's borders to the Euphrates was swallowed by a wave of water and debris. In the makeshift headquarters near Damascus, where Israeli troops had taken up positions, an eerie silence reigned. Lieutenant Colonel Miriam Cohen stood before a map that, before the impact, had marked planned advances eastward. Now the red lines that marked the path to the Euphrates were meaningless. The radios, normally buzzing with reports and orders, remained silent. The ports that should have supplied the offensive were nothing but mud and wreckage. Oil terminals that kept the tanks and aircraft running were burning or unusable. The logistics chain, the backbone of any military operation, had collapsed. Without fuel and supplies, the offensive could not continue. Tank columns that had fought their way through the Syrian desert now stood completely still, their crews waiting and uncertain. They were under constant attack. "What are we supposed to do?" asked a young soldier, staring into the distance where the sky had darkened. Miriam had no answer. Orders from Jerusalem were contradictory, when they came at all. Generals who just days before had spoken of a historic mission were now preoccupied with saving the home front. The disaster had not only destroyed infrastructure but also shattered troop morale. Many soldiers had families in Tel Aviv or Haifa. The news that trickled in was devastating. Thousands missing. Survivors seeking shelter in the hills. The enemy had suddenly become almost secondary. The comet had created a new, overwhelming adversary, nature itself. In the following days, Israeli forces began a precipitate withdrawal from their frontline positions in Syria. Reservists, who would normally have reinforced the offensive, were tied down in the coastal regions, recovering bodies, clearing roads, and evacuating survivors. The Air Force, which had previously secured air superiority over Syria, was now severely hampered in its operations. Most of its coastal bases had become unusable, and fuel shortages made long-range missions impossible. A second fragment of the comet, a glowing giant the size of a small mountain, had struck on a distant part of the world, 100 kilometers off the coast of New York, in the Atlantic. The impact was a gigantic thunderclap that shook the oceans and unleashed a wave of destruction that spread with the speed of an erupting volcano. The east coast of the USA, from Boston to Miami, stared in terror at the horizon, which transformed into a surging, inky black darkness. Clouds of ashen vapor, punctuated by the ominous glow of distant lightning, devoured the sky like a hungry beast. Within hours, all hell broke loose. The tsunami wave, a maelstrom of foaming, salty chaos several meters high, crashed against the shores, swallowing everything in its path. Manhattan, the proud skyline of steel and glass, knelt in the brackish water that gurgled through the streets like a vengeful river. Skyscrapers swayed, cars drifted helplessly, and the screams of thousands fighting for their lives mingled with the screech of collapsing bridges and the wail of sirens. The stock exchange, symbol of American capitalism, sank beneath the tide. Wall Street became an aquarium, trains carrying passengers drowned in subway tunnels, while helicopters circled above the chaos, their searchlights like helpless fireflies in the night. The message from America regarding Ben Royal's war was clear and uncompromising, articulated in diplomatic cables that flew through the night. Israel will henceforth have to concentrate all its efforts on rebuilding its infrastructure, not on territorial expansion. Along the Mediterranean coast, the water transformed. In vast areas between Cyprus and Crete, the surface had turned grey and murky, as if someone had scattered ash upon it. The impact had ripped open the seabed, forcing ancient sediments and layers of sulfur to the surface, poisoning the water. Fish floated on the beaches in dense schools, their scales dull, their eyes milky. Gulls circled helplessly above the decaying water until they themselves perished. Along the coasts of Italy, Greece, and the southern coast of Turkey, the drinking water supply gradually failed. The groundwater in the coastal plains receded or became brackish. The pressure of the wave had altered the pores of the rock, mixing the fresh water with the seawater. In some cities, not a drop came from the taps for days. People stood with jerrycans beside tanker trucks guarded by military convoys. In the heat, the carcasses of dead fish began to decompose. The stench permeated entire regions, a mixture of salt, sulfur, and decay. Old men said they had never experienced anything like it. The sea, once the cradle of life, had become a broth mingled with the blood of dead creatures. And while people tried to find their bearings in this new reality, the sea continued to change. In some places, it churned as if breathing. In others, it was completely still, as if it had transformed into a rigid, lifeless expanse. Scientists attempting to assess the situation with ships and drones found only fragments of data.